Real pleasure to have Robin Yassin-Kassab and Leila Al-Shami with us today to talk about their book, Burning Country. To speak for just a couple minutes, just to introduce and put into some context. We're now in the 6th year of the conflict in Syria. Upwards of 500,000 people have been killed since 2011. Approximately half of the country has been displaced, whether inside or outside Syrian territories. And roughly half of the world's countries currently have some kind of stake invested in the conflict. Today, in the Geneva peace talks, we heard that the High Negotiating Committee, which is the formal opposition body in Geneva, has announced that it is temporarily withdrawing from the political process due to a lack of progress in terms of humanitarian issues on the ground inside Syria and with regards to a rising level of hostilities inside the country. Dozens of sieges continue to be in place, almost entirely by the Syrian regime. Very little humanitarian aid is getting into those besieged territories and elsewhere. And the little that is, the regime is currently actually withdrawing or stealing medical equipment, including atropine, which is used only for preventing chemical weapons effects. Despite major attempts by the international community in the last 6 weeks or so to negotiate large-scale prisoner releases, no one has been released. Kind of on the other side of the conflict, of course, the phenomenon of ISIL or ISIS is very well known, I'm sure, to all of you. And meanwhile, probably overlooked in my opinion, Al-Qaeda is going extremely strong in northern Syria. If anything, Al-Qaeda's central leadership is re-establishing itself in northern Syria instead of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Within all of that context, Robin and Leila have written a truly fantastic book. I would really highly recommend it. And the biggest reason for doing so is an awful lot, and I spoke to Robin about this briefly this morning, I think an awful lot of commentary, certainly in the last year or two, on Syria has really lacked a genuine engagement with Syrians, with those actually involved inside the country, outside the country, in the revolution, in the conflict, in the political discussions. And this book does exactly that. It's really heavily based on talking to people who are hand-to-hand involved in everything that's going on inside Syria and have been for the entirety of the crisis and before that. So it's a real tale of real people, real experiences. And fundamentally, it's a tale of truth. So as I say, it's my real great pleasure to welcome Robin and Leila. And here I'll give over to them. I think they're both going to talk for about 15 minutes. I'll have a brief conversation with them after that, and then we'll open up to question and answers afterwards. So, Robin, Leila.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you for hosting us. And thank you very much to everyone for coming, especially on such a beautiful day when it's very tempting to be sat outside. Well, Charles introduced a little bit about the massive human tragedy that's unfolding in Syria and the crisis there, the humanitarian crisis that's unfolded over the past 5 years. And he also touched on ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, how it's gaining ground in Syria, and the risk that it poses or is posing not only to Syrian civilians, but also increasingly outside. But I think, in general, the media focuses on Syrians either as victims or as terrorists, and there's a big part of the story that's missing. And I want to discuss a little bit today about Syrians as being agents of positive change in their communities, in their society, and the many wonderful things that they've been engaged in over the past 5 years and are continuing to engage in. I think one of the issues with the media or the general discussion is that it focuses a lot on the geopolitics of the situation and the many different countries that have now got involved since the popular revolution erupted and are trying to control and direct that process in a way which is favourable to their own interests and the interests of the elites in their country. But this focus on geopolitics really distracts from the internal factors. What were the internal dynamics within Syria that in 2011 caused so many people to take to the streets, people from all backgrounds, from all sects, from all ethnicities, really calling for freedom, dignity and social justice. And the first call, it was a call for freedom. The Ba'ath Party came to power in 1963 through a military coup, and Hafiz al-Assad took power through an internal coup within the Ba'ath Party in 1970. And really, under his rule, he implemented a totalitarian police state where all political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. So when Bashar came to power in 2000, actually, it was a time of optimism because people thought that Bashar was a reformer and there was going to be some change in Syria. And at that time, a small movement began, which was known as the Damascus Spring. It wasn't a popular movement like we see today. It was a movement which was led by a small group of intellectuals, of writers, of academics, of these kind of figures. But it was a very important movement nonetheless in a society where all kind of political debate had been ruthlessly suppressed. And within this movement, I mean, people started meeting in their homes, in private homes, in Damascus and outside the country, and they were debating issues of political reform, what kind of society they'd like to see. And the movement gave voice to a few key demands. One was for political pluralism, one was for the release of political prisoners, and another was for the end to emergency law, which was ostensibly had been in place for decades because of the war with Israel, but actually this was the law which suspended the constitutional rights of citizens and was being used to arrest political dissidents. But that movement was crushed within a year, and all the key figures were imprisoned, and with that, really hope for political reform in Syria ended. The second key factor which caused people to take to the streets was this call around social justice. And this was really in response to the neoliberal economic policies which had been brought in under Hafiz al-Assad and really sped up under Bashar in his first decade in power. And a particularly corrupt form of crony capitalism was practiced, where the country's wealth was really concentrated in the hands of the Assad family and a few key regime loyalists. And just to give an example, Rami Makhlouf, the cousin of the president, was estimated to control some 60% of the Syrian economy. But meanwhile, the social safety net of the poor was being dismantled, so people were losing subsidies that they depended on, and large sections of the population were becoming increasingly impoverished and really struggling to put food on the table for their families. And this is very important because when the uprising breaks out, what we see is that it breaks out in these disadvantaged rural areas and working class suburbs where people had really been finding life increasingly difficult. But I said I wanted to talk about some of the positive achievements, and I think one of the first positive achievements to have happened over the past 5 years is the way in which people have come together to self-organise and self-govern their communities as the state has been pushed back or has withdrawn from large sections of the country. And by 2014, the state was no longer in control of some 4/5 of the country. So people really had to find a way to come together to ensure that life in their communities could keep operating. And the way that they've done that is to establish local councils. And these local councils are basic administrative structures. They're now the group which is responsible for providing water supply to communities, for providing electricity supply for communities. If they cannot fix the electricity wires, they're being very creative. They're installing solar energy. They're trying to recycle methane gas from waste. These kind of things, keeping schools and hospitals functioning. These are often now makeshift facilities in people's basements because of the massive attacks that have been occurring on educational and health facilities. But these local councils, there's now around 400 or upwards of 400 across the liberated areas. And these councils have had their members either democratically elected or chosen through popular consensus. And I think this is something that's really missing from the discussion on Syria, because when we're hearing about this massive humanitarian crisis, an increasingly brutal conflict, but what we're not hearing about is that all across the country in Syria today, people are practicing democracy and have held the first local elections that have occurred in Syria in over 4 decades. So this is a huge achievement, and I think something we should be very aware of and give as much support to as possible. Another of the positive things to have happened in Syria is really the explosion in civil society that's occurred over the past 5 years. Prior to 2011, there was really no independent or active civil society existing in Syria at all. And today there's hundreds of civil organizations that are doing a wide variety of work. The kinds of civil organizations to be established, well, one kind is women's centers. Syria is a very conservative, patriarchal society, and certainly prior to 2011, there wasn't much in the way of women's activism, certainly not independently of the Women's Union, which was very much dominated by the Ba'ath party, the ruling party in Syria. But today there's hundreds of women's centres throughout the country, and these are centres that really encourage women's activism and really support their participation and involvement in social, economic and political spheres. Another kind of organisation to be established are human rights style organisations, monitoring organisations. For example, we have in Douma, which is a suburb near Damascus, the Violations Documentation Centre, which was established by a young woman called Razan Zaytouna. And in that organisation, they work to monitor violations and human rights abuses being carried out by civilians, not only by the regime, but increasingly by other actors as well. Another example of this style of organisation is in Raqqa. Raqqa, as you might know, is now the de facto capital of ISIS, or the so-called Islamic State. And a group of young activists there have set up an organisation called Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. And this group of activists are really risking their lives to report on conditions inside the city under ISIS and the sort of oppression that people are facing at the hands of ISIS. And they have a really fantastic English resource website that you can look at. Another example of the types of organisations are kind of relief-style organisations where people have come together really to respond to the humanitarian crisis in Syria and to help Syrians within their community or in other communities which are suffering under bombardment and siege. And a very good example of this is the White Helmets, which is Syria's civil defence force. And these really act as first responders. If an area or a building has been hit in an aerial bombardment or in one of these barrel bombs, they're the first on the scene to really pull the victims from the rubble and take them to hospital. And they're also engaging in a lot of trainings with communities around issues such as first aid or how to protect yourself in times of attack. And finally, I just wanted to talk about the media now in Syria, because prior to 2011, there was really no independent media at all. There were 3 state newspapers, and that was it. And now we have an explosion. There's many different kinds of radio stations, for example, in Kafrenbel, which is a town you might have heard of because it does very witty slogans and banners at their Friday demonstrations. They've set up a radio station called Radio Fresh by a group of young activists. And on that radio station, they really debate different issues, the positive and the negative aspects of the revolution, where they see things going in the future. They criticize different groups that are trying to impose an authoritarian vision on the people, not only the regime. And possibly for that reason, Radio Fresh has been attacked twice, once by ISIS and then once by Jabhat al-Nusra, where a few members of the radio station were arrested and their radio equipment confiscated, although they were released a few days later due to popular pressure. Newspapers as well. There's now dozens of free newspapers and magazines existing in the country. One example comes from Daraya, which is a town near Damascus. It's a town which has been barrel bombed daily. It's been subjected to one of these really brutal starvation sieges, which you may have heard about in the news. And it's also suffered from gas attacks. But a group of young women in that community set up a newspaper called Ana Baladi, or Local Grapes, Grapes of My Country in translation. And remarkably, this newspaper focuses on civil resistance and trying to keep those original values of the revolution alive. So I'm going to end there and pass over to Robin, but I just encourage you to learn a little bit about some of these remarkable achievements, because I think they're things that we can really stand in solidarity with and that we really need to be talking about and giving more support to. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that on? Yes? Hello. My voice is loud enough anyway, I don't really need it. It's a great honour to be introduced by Charles Lister, who, Mutual Appreciation Society. I should also say that I think that his book is remarkably well worth reading. It's called The Syrian Jihad. As you can guess from the title, it focuses on the various forms of Islamist groups, from the moderates who seem to be willing to work within a democratic framework if one is ever available, who have a Syrian agenda and a Syrian constituency, all the way through to Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, these transnational groups which have jumped into the chaos and exploited the situation in Syria for their own global ends. It's a great read. It's not just about jihadists. In the early chapters, it definitely puts all of this in context. It talks about the Syrian people and their democratic revolution and how all of this started. I'd like to begin by going back briefly to what Leila was saying about those local councils and to remark how little we hear about them over here. Now, speaking now as a British person, we, Britain and America, in the previous decade, supposedly, it wasn't really about that, but supposedly we cared so much about the Arabs having democracy that we were prepared to invade and occupy Iraq. We moved, hundreds of thousands of men and machines, spent billions of dollars, blew up a lot of stuff, killed a lot of people, supposedly in order to bring the Arabs democracy. It was such a high priority. Of course, it didn't work out very well because demos means people. Only the people themselves can build their own democracy. But here we are today, a decade on, and the Syrians are actually practicing democracy in the most difficult of circumstances, when they're under full military assault from their own state, from the foreign backers of their state, from Iran and Russia primarily, when transnational Sunni and Shia jihadists are jumping in on various sides. In the middle of all that, the Syrians are practicing democracy. Many of these over 400 local and provincial councils are democratically elected, and they are pragmatic, non-ideological bodies, these councils, which are keeping life going in the liberated areas, the liberated but tormented and horribly bombed areas. There would be no life in those areas at all without these self-organized democratic communities, and we don't know about it. I mean, I would guess that an educated, engaged audience like this one, quite a lot of people here have heard of them. If you ask the man in the street, even the man in the street who reads the newspapers, he knows all about the head-cutting jihadists and about the fascist regime and about the chess game of states in Syria, but he knows nothing about these remarkable achievements of the Syrian people in the most desperate of circumstances. That's a great shame, and I think it talks to a failure in our culture and civilization just as much as at the moment there's an obvious crisis in the Middle East. I don't think this information is hard to come by. The local councils each in Arabic, they each have their own Facebook page in which they put up their financial business and other stuff. It's easy to find the story if you want to. Very often our commentators don't want to think about it because they think they already know. They think it's already, they come at it with some pre-existent story, whether it's a Sunni-Shia conflict or imperialism and anti-imperialism or whatever it is. They think they already know, so they don't need to engage with people on the ground and ask them what they're doing, and that's a great shame. I think the other reason why we don't hear much about this civil organization is because it became a war. And once it becomes a war, all of these foreign states jump in. None of them really have the best interests of the Syrian people at heart. They're all playing in their own games for their own reasons. So I'm going to talk briefly, I hope briefly, I'm not very good at being quiet. I'll try to talk briefly about how and why it became a war. Because there are a lot of people, especially, you know, the kind of progressive types that the Syrians would have hoped would be the first to show solidarity with their revolution, and they've often failed for a variety of reasons. And one reason is that it's violent. And you hear people saying things like, look, we supported the protest movement at the start, but once it became violent, once the Syrian revolution decided to militarize, then we can no longer support this. So the first thing is, was it a mistake? And I would say, yes, of course it was a mistake. It was a mistake, and very often the men who picked up weapons knew that it was a mistake, even as they were picking up weapons. Why is it a mistake? Because you started off with this horizontal mass movement which brought together people from a huge range of ideological backgrounds, sectarian backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, regional and class backgrounds. Or it was a leaderless movement protesting for freedom and social justice and dignity. Once it became armed, then you went from a horizontal movement, you went to militias, and each militia has a leader, and each militia leader has to reach out either to a foreign state or to rich expatriate Syrians or to rich men in the Gulf, begging for an arms supply, an ammunition supply, and a money supply. And then what you get, instead of this horizontal mass movement, you get a cacophony of 1,000 authoritarians all competing for attention and funds and so on. And they're all in competition with each other, and it gets much more complicated. And then you get Iran and Russia and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar and the United States and Britain and France and others all jumping in to try and sponsor different people or not sponsor different people, as the case may be. So it was a mistake. The other reason why it was a mistake was that violence alienates key constituencies inside and outside Syria that the revolution needed to win over. When members of the religious minorities, to generalize, when they saw, working class and peasant Muslim men shouting Allahu Akbar with Kalashnikovs in their hands, a lot of them got worried about this. Wait a minute, we thought it was about democracy, but now there's armed men shouting Allahu Akbar. Maybe it's an anti-Christian thing, an anti-Alawi thing. The bourgeoisie, who may have sympathized with a lot of the aims of the original protest movement, again, when they saw working class men with guns in their hands, a lot of them got worried and backed off. And of course, the outside world, as soon as they start seeing armed Arabs shouting Allahu Akbar with guns, they got very scared of it. And this played absolutely into the hands of the regime. But it wasn't a centralized decision. It wasn't the case that the Syrian revolutionaries one day had a mass meeting and debated, shall we be violent or not? And at the end they had a vote, yes, we will be violent, and then they all went out and got guns. It didn't happen like that. It was the product of 1 million individual decisions made under fire. And I'll talk about that. How? I think the first factor was torture. Now, here was a regime, like many regimes around the world, particularly in the Middle East, which has always used torture as part of its armory part of its tactics for silencing people and for terrorizing people, not just the people who were tortured, but the rumors of what happened to these people in prison percolated out into society and shut people up. It terrified people into silence. When the revolution broke out, they weren't able to silence people, but they generalized this tactic and they started doing it en masse. They rounded up tens of thousands of protesters and organizers who were non-violent. They were shouting Selmiye, things like that. The Syrian people are one, non-sectarian. They rounded these people up for death by torture, including children of primary school age and up, children as young as 6 and 7. Some reports say babies too. I'm not sure if that's true, but one of the iconic cases was a 13-year-old boy called Hamza al-Khatib, who was picked up by pro-regime thugs as a demonstration outside Deraa in the south, and a few days later his mutilated corpse was returned to his parents. Now, usually when a fascist regime tortures somebody to death, they get rid of the body. They bury it or burn it, and then they tell the family he killed himself in detention. That's the end of the story. In this case, they were returning the mutilated corpses of children to their families, precisely because they wanted a response. They wanted a reaction. Hamza, for example, his penis had been cut off. There were gunshot wounds in his limbs. He'd been carved up with knives. He was cut all over. And he had cigarette burns and electrical burns all over his body, this 13-year-old child. And another factor is rape. Again, the regime has always raped people, men and women, in detention. When the revolution broke out, they started moving into rebellious neighborhoods and villages and then going into people's homes, raping wives in front of husbands, husbands in front of wives, children in front of parents, parents in front of children, again, because they wanted a response. You know, Syria is, in general, a conservative religious society in which sexual honor is considered to be as important or maybe more important than life itself. But even in liberal Washington, I think that you know, if the government started doing this to people en masse, there would immediately be an armed response. People would think, even if I'm a pacifist, I need to go out and get a gun, at least to defend my neighborhood, my front door. Next, defectors. When you ask men who've joined the military to shoot on their countrymen day after day after day, their unarmed countrymen, inevitably some of these men are going to defect at the first opportunity. And when they did defect, they didn't have the option of just going home and keeping out of it, because they would be hunted down. So they had no choice but to become guerrilla fighters. I think the regime did this deliberately. It deliberately provoked a war. And people would say, why on earth would a regime or a government or a state provoke a war against itself? And I would say there are two answers to that. The first one is that it knew that it couldn't survive a genuine reform process. If there was a real reform process, one thing would have led to another, and at the end of this process, at best, the president and his elite would have ended up, at best, in prison, stripped of their stolen wealth. The second answer is that they'd done it before and it had worked. In 1978, there was a subversive movement against the regime. It wasn't a mass popular mobilization like 2011. It was a political thing, but it involved Islamists, nationalists, leftists, communists, Democrats, the whole range. After 4 years of ruthless repression from the regime, all that was left was the armed wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which out of stupidity or desperation staged an armed uprising in the city of Hama, at which point the regime said, good, it's a military situation, you've brought guns into it. They went in and destroyed the historical center of the city and killed somewhere between 10 and 40,000 people. We don't know, because journalists didn't get access, and it was before the Violations Documentation Center and mobile phone films and so on. But the memory of that horror silenced the Syrians for another 3 decades. I would further argue that the regime went out of its way to make this as sectarian as possible. In 2011, at the same time that they were rounding up tens of thousands of peaceful, non-sectarian protesters for indefinite detention or death by torture, they released about 1,500 men from prison. The majority of these men were Salafist jihadists who'd been fighting in Iraq, partly against the American occupation, largely against the Shia population, which helped to precipitate a civil war there. When these men came back to Syria, the regime arrested them, kept them in prison until it needed them in 2011. And high-level defectors say it went beyond releasing these people, that there was even logistical help to help them set up their militias. And the leaders of Jaish al-Islam, Ahrar al-Sham, including Nusra and ISIS, a lot of their leaders were part of this amnesty, this prisoner release. In the summer of 2012, I'm on my last minute now, I think, in the summer of 2012, there were a string of organized sectarian massacres on the central plain between Homs and Hama, which then actually stopped. They happened in the summer of 2012 and then stopped because they'd achieved what needed to be achieved. In these cases, the army would shell a Sunni village, a rebellious Sunni village, and then Shabiha militias made up exclusively of Alawis from the nearby villages would go in and cut the throats of men, women, and children, which of course enraged some of the men in that Sunni village, who went on film and screamed, "You Alawi bastards! We thought this was about democracy, but now you're going to come and cut our children's throats? We're going to come and kill your children." At which point a lot of Alawis who saw these films very understandably thought, well, maybe we sympathized with them, and maybe we disapproved of our young men being rounded up and sent in to cut their children's throats. But when we see them saying they want to come and kill our children, we have no choice but to stand with this regime, even though we know it's criminal and it's destroying the country. So this was very coldly intelligent. The two targets of President Assad as he's built up his jihadist opposition have been the Alawi community that he relies upon, because so many officers are from that community. He wants to scare them into loyalty. And secondly, the West. And it's really worked very well in the West, because there's now a general consensus that the greater evil are the mad headcutters of ISIS, who don't just want to kill people in Syria, they also want to kill people here. But they are a symptom, not a cause. President Assad, I would argue, is the cause. And it's very sad that journalists, commentators often play along with this. Patrick Cockburn, for example, who's unfortunately taken as an authority on Syria by many people, although he hasn't visited anywhere in Syria without a regime minder, he describes the Syrian opposition, quote, as an opposition which shoots children in the face for minor blasphemy. Now that's ISIS, that's not the Syrian opposition. The Syrian opposition has given tens of thousands of lives in the fight against ISIS. The Syrian opposition includes, as Leila was talking about, over 400 civilian councils, many of them democratically elected. It includes people producing these free newspapers, free magazines, free radio stations. It includes medical workers, intellectuals, decent, ordinary people who are questioning everything, questioning all forms of authoritarianism, and we're ignoring those people, and it's a real tragedy. Thanks very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for both of you. That was two such in-depth statements that I repeatedly had to cross out questions I was going to ask. So, so hopefully my first question will lead into others. I think both of you talked for a while about the practice of democracy within liberated areas in Syria, and I think certainly as another person following Syria, that's been another frustration. For me, is that the world doesn't know enough about those kind of practices happening inside Syria, and often actually involving armed groups as well, which I think is quite a fascinating dynamic. But given that, and especially given the fact that things in Geneva today have looked so difficult, and that the opposition is at least temporarily withdrawing, a fear I have in my mind is that how long can people continue to practice democracy as the more extreme elements are gaining in power? As politics fails, extremists gain. And we've seen in certain towns and villages in Idlib, certainly since the cessation of hostilities developed, that people came out onto the streets, they protested against Jabhat al-Nusra, but as we have essentially refused or ignored their demands for help, Nusra has essentially regained the initiative, or it seems that way. And I worry because a lot of those towns, including Kafr al-Nabl, is where some of that really powerful democratic values still exist. So first of two-part questions. I mean, how do we avoid that degradation of that sort of liberal democratic thought in liberated territories? And then second of all, how do we better inform the general public and policymakers in the Western world about this situation? I mean, it's certainly something I struggle with, but perhaps you've got better answers than I do.
Well, yeah, I mean, I share your concerns, Charles. I think it's not an easy situation. There's so many forces which are against the popular struggle, whether that's states, whether that's other groups, other authoritarian groups that have come into power. I think it's very interesting the way that the Syrian people's struggle has radicalized over time to not only being a struggle against the regime, but also against these jihadi or very authoritarian groups. And you mentioned, I think today's maybe the 34th or 35th continuous day of protests in Idlib against Jabhat al-Nusra, but also in other areas in the Raqqa where Jaish al-Islam has really tried, when it came in, to set up parallel structures to the local councils. It tried to set up its own councils, its own Sharia courts. And again, there was a lot of popular opposition to that. You know, I don't know ultimately what will be the situation. I hope that whatever happens, I mean, two things. I think one, we need as quickly as possible to get a ceasefire, because once the bombs stop falling, we have seen that civil activism has regained a foothold. And surely, certainly when you speak to many Syrians, I've spent a lot of times with refugees in Iraq, in Jordan, in Lebanon, also in the course of our book. I mean, activists are desperate to go back and to rebuild their country. Ordinary people are desperate to go back and rebuild their country. But the main issue is the aerial attacks. That's the bombs which are falling and those safety issues. So moving towards a ceasefire is the most important thing. And then all I can hope, I mean, I'm not that hopeful that we're going to have a transition into a democracy. I think we've gone past that. What I'm hoping for is that we will get to a situation where the democratic space can still be protected, where people are able to go back and they're able to keep working and keep moving things forward. I mean, that's what I hope could be the best outcome in this difficult situation we're facing at the moment.
I'd add, if I can, briefly, that, I mean, I think that the United States and other governments do actually work with the local councils in some cases, but they never talk about it. Why do they do it? Because if they want to deliver aid to people in Aleppo, for example, they find that the only effective way in which they can get the aid to the people on the ground they want to get it to is by working through these organised councils that the people themselves have built on the ground. But they never talk about it in public, and I wish they would, and I think that's because they don't want to give them political representation. These councils are the only representatives of, representative Syrians that we have, the only people that have been elected and that are doing practical work on the ground. So they should be mentioned and talked about. They should at very least be part of the opposition negotiations committee. We've got the leaders of militias there, and probably they need to have a say, but we definitely need to have these councils there too. They should be part of any real solution if we were moving towards one. Also about the Free Army still exists. It does remarkable work against both ISIS and Assad whenever it's able to, whenever it's permitted to. The supplies to the Free Army have been on and off, and mainly off. Occasionally the United States has allowed the Saudis or others to send in some anti-tank weapons. Not one anti-aircraft weapon has ever come through, and that's what those communities really need to defend themselves from aerial assault. I'm not talking about backing them with weapons that they need to invade Assad's heartlands or anything like that, but just to defend their communities from aerial assault. I think it's a tragedy that hasn't happened. I think that's a major reason for the growth of the Islamist militias and for the growth of groups like ISIS in the country. It's the fact that those people who should have been supported weren't. America has been vetoing that. Now, if America doesn't want to get involved itself, it really shouldn't get involved. It should let other people supply those weapons. It should stop vetoing. And actually, America has, in the name of withdrawal, it's kind of fairly publicly been handing Syria over to other savage imperialisms, primarily Russia and Iran. And that's disastrous. It's not working. You know, Russian and Iranian policy is building up ISIS, for example, and then America gets dragged in and ends up bombing the symptoms. So I could go on, but I won't.
With the interest of time, I'll ask one more question, probably a difficult one. Robin, you kind of described a really sort of horribly smart and brutal regime that has manipulated the opposition time and time again into doing what it wants, and probably the rest of the world in doing what it wants. How can Syrians overcome that? I mean, how is there ever a way out of that manipulation? And then just to tag on to that question, you may have something to say about the statement that came out of the Alawite community a couple of weeks ago, which was something certainly I had been aware of that was coming for a long while. And there is a lot of restlessness within senior figures within that community on the coast. And there has been for at least a couple of years, and I wonder if that is an opportunity that the broader Syrian sort of revolutionary community can take advantage of.
What Alawite statement are you referring to?
It was I forget exactly how long it was. I think it was about 8 pages in Arabic. It was a statement released by it wasn't announced how many, but it was a fairly significant number of senior figures within the Alawite community on Syria's coastal region. They were doing a number of things in the statement, but probably one of the most significant politically was distancing themselves from the Assad regime, as well as a number of sort of theological points which they made, distancing themselves from Shia Islam, for example.
That was a key thing as well, to distance themselves from Iran and to get out of this Sunni Shia narrative. I mean, yeah, I haven't read the statement in depth because we've been travelling and I can't keep up with all the emails that we're getting sent, but I do think it is significant, and I think it's really an opportunity that the opposition should grab to reach out at this point to Alawis and to try and build bridges. And there have been fantastic efforts on the ground to do that. We discussed in the book, we interviewed a guy called Mohammed Abu Haja from Tartus, who, when the revolution broke out in Tartus, the people in Tartus started organizing revolutionary committees to organize protests. But how it worked was that one group, it's a coastal city which has a mixed population, and there sprang up a Sunni-only group and there sprang up an Alawi-only group. So Mohammed and his friends worked to build bridges between the two and to create a group in which people from different sects was participating. And they've been doing really interesting work trying to build bridges amongst the communities for what comes after in Syria. And I think that's very important. I mean, certainly every time I'm speaking to Syrian activists, and I don't know if this work is being done or not, I've not come across people engaged in it, but I'm saying, you know, we should be speaking to activists from the former Yugoslavia, from South Africa, from these places, and really to learn how they overcame these divisions which have built up in the course of the conflict.
And of course, others failed too. Assad wouldn't have been able to get away with it and do what he wanted if it wasn't for the weaknesses in Syrian society, which his regime had helped to keep alive, but definitely were there. And also in the region and also in the world. So the Al-Qaeda types were waiting to make themselves relevant again in 2011 with the Arab Spring, the outbreak of the Arab Spring and the apparent immediate success of popular protest and civil engagement. It really looked, a lot of commentators at the time were saying, oh, Al-Qaeda is completely irrelevant now. And for 5 minutes it looked like that. And it was the savage violence of these regimes that brought it back and gave it an opportunity. So those people were waiting for an opportunity which the regime violence gave them. The elites, you know, if you read the book, we've also criticized, and more to the point, a lot of the grassroots Syrians that we've interviewed have criticized the Syrian National Council, the coalition. I think these are made up of good people in general, very good principled people who did their best. But they never became very relevant. They never were able to build their legitimacy from the grassroots up. They tried to do it top down, which was an absurdity in the revolutionary situation. Fundamentally, they never got serious support from foreign states, and therefore they never had a relevant role to play. The weaknesses inside Syrian society, it was never this happy mosaic of sects as the propaganda. There was always sectarian and regional and class divisions, and ethnic divisions, which were going to come to the fore in a war situation whenever they were put under huge pressure. So, and then in the region, you know, you've got the Saudis and the Iranians playing their chess game with each other. You've got Sunni Shia narratives into which all of this fits. You've got the American fear of engagement in the Middle East because of what happened in the last decade, etc., etc., etc. You've got Europe's fear of migrants at the moment, and it's somehow become an election issue here. So rabid dogs, Syrian refugees, even though there's only 2,500 in this enormous country. So the whole world has collaborated in it. And primarily, I mean, Assad, even with this sectarian engineering and creating a war, I still think he would have gone in 2013 if Iran hadn't come in and started running his military fight back. And then in 2015, even with tens of thousands of Iranian troops on his front lines and tens of thousands of transnational Shia jihadists on his front lines, organized by Iran, still the Russians had to come in and rescue him. Back at the end of last year, he was losing battle after battle after battle. He'd ran out of fighting men. So it's massive international intervention which has saved the guy. How can Syrians do something about it? Again, through the experience of democratic civil organization, because they have done remarkable things in remarkably difficult circumstances. And again, the councils, if by some miracle Iran and Russia withdrew and he collapsed tomorrow, the Alawis in places like Tartus and Latakia would by necessity have to organize their own local councils. They would elect or choose their own representatives in order to deal with the Sunnis in the next town. And then you might have a situation where with some kind of decentralization, you could deal with these explosive polarizations. For example, the local council in Tartus would probably decide that in this city we're going to have bars and nightclubs. Whereas in Hama or Deir ez-Zor, where it's more conservative Sunni Muslim, people might decide in this city we're going to ban alcohol. But both cities could survive under the Syrian umbrella. And the fact remains that the vast majority of Syrians still want to remain in one diverse country, and they don't want another sectarian carve-up. That was too long, sorry.
No, but absolutely right, though, so thank you for saying it. I think we'll open up to Q&A now, so...
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst. As such, I get to meet a lot of military people, some of them pretty senior. And without exception, every one of them believes that Daesh will not be extinguished without some ground force. American ground force, Arab ground force, Turkish ground force, they don't care. But the bottom line is you do not get rid of Daesh without a ground force. And most of them would say that you probably need a bullet through al-Assad's head to take care of the whole problem. So, seeing that there's no ground force and no magic bullet, how do each of you view the end of this?
Well, there is a ground force because you have the Free Syrian Army on the ground, you have Kurds on the ground that have been fighting Daesh. I mean, the Free Syrian Army pushed Daesh out of the whole of northern eastern Syria. No, they won't. But the Free Army will. You would need to work with Arab forces on the ground. It can only be achieved by Arab forces on the ground. I personally don't believe that Daesh is the biggest threat to Syria, because I think should the regime fall, the one thing that will unite both pro-regime and anti-regime Syrians is to get rid of this foreign occupation force, which is what Daesh is. I think long-term, a far bigger threat comes from groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, which are really deeply embedded within Syrian society.
Yeah, I'd back that up. The Free Army, again, you know, a lot of commentators say they don't exist, but they obviously do. They've just taken a lot of villages in northern Aleppo with Turkish artillery help. So the Kurds have done remarkably well in areas where where Kurds are in a majority and neighboring areas. You're quite right, they can't then move out of those areas deep into Arab majority territory because the local people will be suspicious of them and they themselves don't see a great interest in doing that in land which they're not going to hold and it's not going to have any use for them. But the Free Army in January 2014, the Free Army and the Islamic Front militias and Nusra actually drove ISIS out of the whole of western Syria, out of Aleppo city, and they were ISIS was actually on its last legs in places like Deir ez-Zor too in the east, and it was only after they'd captured all the American weaponry in Iraq and the money in the banks in Mosul that they were able to come back in force. The Free Army has never benefited from either Russian or American air power in the way that the Kurds on occasion have, and I think that if they did, they would be able to win quite easily against ISIS because most Arab Syrians don't like ISIS and they recognize that it's an outside force that is exploiting the situation. I do think that it's going to take getting rid of Assad first because, you know, there was this training program which famously didn't work in which was it 54 or 80 or something people turned out for this and it kind of fizzled away into nothing. The main reason why the Americans couldn't find Syrian fighters to sign up to this was because they were asking them to pledge not to fight Assad, just to be a kind of mercenary force that would go and fight ISIS. And of course they thought, well, no, we'll fight both enemies. We see them as one enemy. But if you're going to tell us not to fight the guy that's helped ISIS come in and the guy that's primarily responsible for the civilian casualties and for bombing our cities and for raping us and torturing us, then no, we don't want to be involved. So I think that the outside world has to recognize that for Syrians on the ground, you have to address both problems at once, both Assad and ISIS. And then you will find a lot of people who will want to sign up to that battle, and they will be able to do it. They've done it before. They're good fighters, especially by now.
Hi, Stuart White from the State Department going out to Turkey to work on Syria issues. One correction first, and then I have a question. We do, and I don't want to go on the record here, we do a lot with local councils. We do give them a lot of assistance, but it's not talked about for two reasons. One, we don't want our ability to give assistance to be hampered if it becomes widely publicized. And these people who are already under, obviously, a huge threat, being inside Syria, working, and being under attack from Nusra and everybody else and Halab and all these other places, don't want to be publicized because they would be immediately attacked for accepting help from the evil imperialists. So my question is more to U.S. policy. What do you think we, the United States government, should be doing, especially in light of the fact that we're likely to have a new president in 8 months, 9 months, that could potentially resolve this or get towards a successful resolution of the war, or end of the war at least?
Natasha Hall from Center for Civilians in Conflict. I just got back from Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, about to go back. My question was actually on the other side, if you've seen any fissures, because you talked about this letter from the Alawi community. I've heard a bit about, they're still getting a lot of recruits, but Hezbollah fighters too getting really sick of being cannon fodder, as the Alawis are, as I'm sure the Afghans are, but they have less of a choice in the matter. Ways to kind of take advantage of those fissures, possibly, if they do, exist on a larger scale. I think that's kind of, I mean, even for me, having lived in Syria right before the revolution, it's sort of the blind spot for a lot of us if there is any discontent in that community, because obviously without those people, Assad can't stand, and a lot of them are foreigners as well. Thanks.
Hi, how's it going? My name is Adham Sahlul. I'm a concerned citizen and Syrian American. Excuse me. So, welcome to Washington. You're in a town where Syrian Americans have, been advocating for Syria, for democracy in Syria for, the last 5 years. And I think it took about like 3 or 4 years for think tanks and, civil rights groups and, human rights groups to start to really, start to work with Syrian Americans and listen to Syrian voices on the ground. And to this day, a lot of the established Arab American and Muslim American groups didn't really rally around Syria or support the Syrian Americans. And I think because of that, we were looking for allies, and a lot of those allies turned out to be, groups like, neocons and so on. And that further discredited us. And the same groups that, I did progressive activism with in Chicago are, the Stop the War coalition people and people who are now voting for Bernie Sanders. And so I guess my question is, who are the allies of pro-democracy Syrians? Is this an orphaned revolution?
About what should America do? I've kind of, given up asking America to do things. I don't really expect it, and I don't think many Syrians do at this stage. But if there was going to be a no-fly zone, I must say I think that would be a very good idea. I think that, stopping bombs dropping on Syria would be fantastic. That doesn't mean going in and doing a regime change. It means stopping him bombing the cities. The real reason why there's an enormous migration crisis, refugee crisis, is because of aerial bombardment. The main reason why ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra are finding, fertile territory in which to grow is because of the aerial bombardment. It's Assad's scorched earth and now Russia's scorched earth. Of course, now that Russia has been allowed to take control of the Syria file, it's much more difficult to do that. But I think that an American administration that is concerned with its own interests first, and then with Europe, and then with the Middle East, should be doing its best to stop appeasing Russia and to do everything it can to stop bombs falling on civilian communities in Syria for everybody's interest. That's the first thing. If you're not prepared to organize a no-fly zone, that's fine. It's no reason why America should be going over and doing that, except it's in its own interests. But if it doesn't want to, that's fine. It should then allow the Free Army militias to have anti-aircraft weapons so they can do it themselves, so they can defend themselves. I think that's the fundamental thing to stop this thing escalating. It's still getting much worse. And then again, second thing is to recognize the councils. I hear what you're saying. I thank you for telling me that. I've never met anyone from the State Department who's told me before why they don't mention the councils, although they are doing work with the councils, European governments too. I understand those security concerns that the people on the ground have, and that's fair enough, and it's a delicate issue. Nevertheless, I feel that on the political level, America should be working to ensure that council representatives are at least involved in the opposition delegations, that they have some kind of political recognition on the world stage, because I do think they're, in the long term, part of the only solution. About Alawis, it's absolutely important to recognize, if you read our book, we take into account and try and explain why the majority of Alawis have stayed loyal to the regime, most of them out of fear of revenge, fear of the alternatives. Having said that, there are many Alawis, and a lot of them in private, secretly, who are helping the revolution, who are doing their best to smuggle aid into besieged areas. There are high-profile Alawis like the novelist Samar Yazbek, who's written 2 great books about the crisis, which are translated into English, like Fadwa Ismail, the actress who was leading protests in Homs in 2011. So there are key voices in the Alawi community who have tried hard to aid the revolution, and it's important, especially amongst us Sunni Arabs, to recognize that this isn't the cut and dried sectarian conflict that the president wants to show it as. Probably you have more to say about Alawis. There are a lot of Alawis leaving the country, to avoid conscription, or joining local gangs. They're going and joining local gangs so that, because the local warlord can keep them out of the national army. They don't want to go and die in Deir ez-Zor or somewhere far away. So if they join a local gang, when the army comes to conscript them, the local warlord will say, no, this guy's working for me, he stays defending this village, he stays at home. So all of that is going on. And who are the allies of the Syrians? It's really hard to answer that question, sadly, tragically. I mean, the realists still seem to have this idea that the Arab world can go back to the security states, that these populations... I mean, when Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, there were 6 million Syrians, and most of them were farmers. By 2011, there were 23 million Syrians, most of them urban, all of them experts at using proxy servers on the internet. So despite the best efforts of this supposedly Arabist regime, they were better connected with other Arabs and other people elsewhere than ever before. It's impossible, it's not realism, it's surrealism or madness or fantasy to imagine that we're going to go back to the old system in which the Arabs can be ruled by security states and by dictators that you can threaten or bribe or pass on the head and get what you want. It's not, that's ridiculous. We're not going, so the realists are no help at all. The leftists are no help at all because a lot of them are wrapped up in silly conspiracy theories. They think it's all an American regime change plot against all the evidence. They see it in some kind of silly binary terms. I'm against American imperialism, therefore I support President Putin's anti-imperialism, which is insane because that's also, and even more so, a savage imperialist power, particularly at the moment, a very worrying one. Or I'm against right-wing, pro-American, Saudi Arabian Islamic fundamentalism. Good, well done. So therefore I support radical, progressive Iranian Islamic fundamentalism as it sends hundreds of thousands of occupation Shia jihadists around the Arab world and creates so many problems. And even though it's killing trade unionists and gay people and dissenters of any kind at home in Iran. So this silly binarism, unfortunately, we're not going to get any help from the so-called left either. I don't know. I mean, maybe from human beings. Maybe I found that appealing to people outside of political categories. Before this book, I think the strength of this book is that we've amplified the voices of grassroots Syrians. And those who read it, they may not agree with our political ideas, but they will at least hear that these are human beings doing their best in a very difficult situation. I was talking before with somebody about being part of the Syria Speaks book and tour, which approaches it through culture rather than through politics. And often it's easier to communicate with people that way because people don't have these preconceptions when it comes to culture, when it comes to human stories. But I don't know, it's very depressing. If you find the answer, do let me know. Well, journalists have been, there've been some great journalists, some of whom have given their lives to try and get the story out of Syria. Some really brave people, as well as tens of thousands of Syrian citizen journalists. You've had lots of, Anthony Shadid died there, Mary Colvin died there. Many great, brave journalists who've done as much as they possibly can. But then there's also people like the Fisks and the Cobans who've just got their own agenda, who regurgitate the propaganda that they're fed, very obviously, if you know something about Syria. And a lot of people rely on these commentators rather than talking to Syrians, sadly.
I'll just add very quickly to what the US should be doing. I'm also of the view that the US should just back off and stay out of Syria. I think the best intervention is on the humanitarian level. I've spent a lot of time in the region. The situation's very, very desperate in those host countries, which are taking the vast majority of the impact. So I think much more support to host countries in the region, primarily to Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, much more increase in humanitarian aid. I mean, in Lebanon, it's the official figures are 1 in every 5 people of the population is a Syrian refugee, and unofficially it's going to be much higher than that. Refugees are not allowed to work in Lebanon or Jordan. They have no access to livelihood opportunities. Many of the children are out of school. This has 2 impacts. One, it could lead to destabilization in those countries because of their scarcity of resources and the increasing tensions between refugees and host populations. And two, that's why people are going in such massive numbers to Europe. I think much more Syrians would prefer to live in the region because the culture's more similar, they're much more at home there, than to take a very risky journey to Europe. So much more assistance needs to be given to those countries.
With that, I hate to say it, but I think we're going to have to close. I'm sure Robin and Leila would be happy to answer any more questions that any of you might have. But with that, I just want to say thank you again to Robin and Leila, and please do get their book if you're at all interested in reading about real Syrian stories behind the revolution.